most people, except I would say a very tiny stratum of very elite academic philosophers, are also educators. And so you have to think, I think, very carefully about whether that's something that you're enthused about doing. I think one of the things that, to my observation, can lead people to be dissatisfied with an academic career is that they underestimate, right, the degree of commitment to being an educator that it requires, and they never kind of find the passion for being an educator. They ultimately, kind of treat it as something of a burden, right, to be born in exchange for the other parts of the work. And I think that that's a good recipe for being dissatisfied and burned out, because almost all of us, right, have to teach, right. I I don't want to make that sound like we're forced at gunpoint or something, but I would say we get to teach. I like it, but there are people who perhaps don't cotton on to the educational part, and I think that some of those are some of the least satisfied academics that I've met, actually.
That's strange for me. I would say actually teaching would probably be the more attractive part of the job. Personally, I think it can be very fulfilling and rewarding, and you get to do your own stuff while also learning at the same time. So
I think it depends on the person actually working in academia. So generally, academia is moving toward the research, right? So what's the cutting edge research that your original contribution to the field of philosophy that you're actually specializing in? So like the international recognitions and also like kind of validation system is usually what type of publications you've done and how it's contributing to the ongoing discussion in philosophy. So I think the general tendency is like, okay, research first and then education second. I mean, I think that's the most European research institutions are like that, right? But I think Michael's point is right in a sense that if you revere this sense of these privileged positions that you don't have to work 9 to 5, you teach a little bit, but then most of the time you can actually read books and write your own books that you can actually dedicate yourself into the research, then you realize academia is not designed for that. There's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of 9 to 5 work, So I think sometimes you have this sort of romanticized idea of academia as this sort of protected from, commodified world of capitalistic realism. It's not. I think there's a lot of work in academia that is quite mundane, it's not protected from that. But that doesn't say that you can use this platform to do what you really want to do, to educate students and learn from teaching and, dedicating yourself to the research and, protecting yourself from this like instrumentalizing relationship that kind of capitalism forces us to engage in. I think you can actually step away from that because, nobody's checking how much money we made with our program per person, right? If you go to sales, like immediately how much product did you sell? So you don't have to kind of participate in that competition. So it does protect us from a certain degree, but I think if you romanticize it as this utopia, you'll be quickly disappointed. Yeah.
As you're saying, I've heard that there is quite a lot of pressure to publish, and one of my reservations, at least, would be in line with another question I was going to ask about specialization. Actually, how you're forced to specialize. I mean, one of the things I like a lot about philosophy is how broad and holistic it is. You can do lots of different things, and obviously in a PhD especially, you have to really hyper focus on something. And I guess when you're publishing journals, I'm wondering if sometimes it can feel like you're just hyper fixating on this very small topic which no one cares about, and no one's gonna read about it.
Even you picked it up and you're not interested. Yeah, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, that's the question. What is your experience dealing with this?
So I think that relates to this public philosophy and how to make specialized philosophical concept that's accessible to the general public, right? That it seems like academia is moving toward more specializations and really focused. I think it really depends, because you could specialize in something that like is really hot right now, but then 5 years from now, when you actually start looking for a job, that's just overdone, right? And nobody's interested in hiring any more topic that could happen. And my area of specialization is the world of philosophies is the widest you can ever get, right? And people just kind of look at me and think, what is that? Because it's not specialization. But that actually gave me a job. If you ask me 5 years ago, right, like, do you think you ever be able to get a job in academia with your general interested in this non-Western philosophy, I would have said no. It would take 40 years for the European academia to realize that we need to invest in this. But I am here, so like I cannot talk like that anymore, right? I think it's just, it really depends what you're interested in. If you're really interested in broader topic, I think you could go more broader topic. And I do have one example recently. So there was somebody who did a PhD in University of Dundee, work on this project on Deleuze and Nagarjuna, right?
Okay.
And if you did this project 5 years ago, there's no way you can't publish. You can't find publishers that will be able to pick it up, and you won't be able to find a job. And especially if you've never published anything before that, no publisher would pick up the manuscript. But because I'm here, they sent me the manuscript to my table, and I read the manuscript, and I said, this is the best I've read over the last 3-4 years, right? So even though the author hasn't published anything, you better actually think about publishing this, because this is a great manuscript, right? So for that person, they didn't follow this publish or perish. And it spent 5 years, 6 years, I don't know how long, just on this single manuscript. But it's going to get published by one of the top publisher because it's a great product, you know? So I don't think it is bad in general, but I don't think that's the best way to survive academia. And I think if you're interested
to just publish as much as possible.
Yeah, but like, again, I'm just saying, if you want to focus on just on your thesis for the 4 or 5 years of your PhD, and if you can find somebody who can actually look at your product and say, this is great, that's better than publishing 4 or 5 articles somewhere, you know, in my field. So I don't think that there's just general rules. You know, I mean, right now it's like a publish or perish. Used to be like 10 years ago. Now it's like a publish and perish. So you could not get a job even if you publish, right? So what makes you get a job is not about publication, but it's something else. And it doesn't have to be 10 articles, 15 articles, 20 articles, but it could be like 5 articles plus something else that you can actually offer to the table. That this
what does something else
be? And I don't know what that something is going to be by the time you finish your PhD. You know, it's something that we have to think about. Maybe public philosophy is the next move that we would have to make. Right? We need to make philosophy content more accessible to the general public. Maybe being able to actually broadcast philosophy content, that could also become something very important. Yeah. What do you think, Mike?
Well, I do think that it's obvious, like absolutely uncontroversial, that research expectations that people have to meet in order to secure jobs in philosophy have gone up, right, quite a lot over the past generation. So that's obvious. Jobs that you could have gotten in 1995 with, you know, a certain research profile, you would not be competitive for that same job now with the equivalent research profile. So research expectations have gone up. That said, right, I think it's worthwhile for people who are considering an academic career to ask themselves what kind of academic career they want, right? Everyone has to publish, I think, now in order to be a competitive candidate. It doesn't necessarily follow that you're best off for having published the most, right? And I think one thing that I invite students to think about is, you know, that we, right, as academic philosophers who are supervising PhD students, I think tend to sort of, you know, whether intentionally or not, craft students who kind of look a bit like us, right, in terms of the sorts of, you know, things that they publish, where they publish, how much they publish, which qualifies them, I suppose, if it qualifies for anything, for jobs like our own, right? But there's a lot of different kinds of jobs out there in academic life, right? I think the American context in particular, you know, offers opportunities for people who might want an academic career that might look a bit different from the way it looks, say, at the University of Edinburgh or at a lot of European universities. So, you know, the United States has a lot of institutions of higher education. Yes, there are the Ivy League schools, but there's an enormous number of state universities. There's an enormous number of smaller private colleges. There's the community and junior colleges. And the ways that you become hired at those different places vary, right? What Harvard is looking for is very different from what Orange County Community College is looking for. And if you are open to the idea of teaching a lot, right? Doing a lot of teaching, maybe having very modest research expectations, and you're open to that as a career, then, you should think about, how do I make myself attractive to places where your research is maybe not the thing that they prioritize the most, right? There are plenty of places that do prioritize research the most, but there's also a significant number that don't, right? And, you look at who gets hired at, let's say Cambridge University here in the UK versus who gets hired at, I don't know, Roehampton University here in the UK. They look pretty different, right? Because they're looking for different things, right? They serve different students and they have different, kind of institutional objectives. So yes, you do have to publish, and specialization is in that way kind of inevitable, right? You can't get out of it, right? There is no there is no journal that publishes an article, my philosophy of everything, or whatever. Right? Specialization is kind of baked into the process, but maximal publication isn't.
Right.
Because
exactly.
you might target different kinds of institutions, right? And some of the institutions are not necessarily going to be thrilled with an applicant that has first-rate publications by research institution standards, but has very little teaching experience, or none. Right. So that just goes back to, I suppose, something we kind of began the conversation with. You need to understand why why you want to get into the academic world, and what kinds of jobs you're looking for, and what you would what you would ultimately find satisfactory or not.
I think the publishing aspect of it, once you actually enter that graduate program and then you write and then train to actually publish articles, it becomes like, when you are undergraduate students, publishing is something that's an unreachable goal. But I think once you enter the graduate program, it becomes just part of academic life, so much so that I think the publishing itself is not going to be like really difficult pattern, but it's going to be more like, do you feel like that publications?
I will say that I think that the biggest stumbling block for most PhD students in philosophy is making the transition from being students to being scholars.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think that the ability or inability to publish articles, say, tracks pretty well how effectively you're making that transition. There are many students who are good students, right? They will learn a lot of philosophy. They're good at reading things, but there is a certain skill set involved in figuring out how to make a meaningful contribution
to the field.
Yeah. That some people don't develop.
I see.
And my experience as a PhD student, I had a number of peers who I think stumbled just at that point. They understood a lot of philosophy, but they didn't have anything to say about it. Right?
I see. Right.
And you have to have something to say ultimately, right? You have to have some contribution.
Yeah, maybe that's the point I really want to say, that people who survive in academia, that the ones that I really look up to are the ones that not only knowledgeable about the field, but they have something to say.
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know how to describe this, but it's just the extra factor of like the reason why I'm specialized in this. There's something in that specialization. I can read, I can see why you specialize in this. There's a kind of sense of like urgency or some kind of commitment that they feel that this topic is important for me, and here is why. And I think that's more important than whether or not you actually can publish, to me.
Well, do you think it's a phenomenon at all where there isn't anything to say, and so you have to sort of just, almost make up things to say and a point to make, and you angle
to add some new contribution to the field originality clause?
Because you need to publish and you need to
that's why I decided not to specialize in Kant and Hegel, because I read all the secondary sources and I felt like all the questions that's being asked and answered, and if you talk to the Kantians, they would just vehemently disagree with me, right? But if you talk to me when I was the first year PhD student, I went to my supervisor. There's no way I could propose something on German idealism, because I feel like everything has been written. And he navigated me to a different area where I could see, I can see the area that I can contribute, I can something to say. And that was like comparative and Japanese philosophy. At that time, nobody was exploring this field. My professor was saying that, this is going to be the future. You should invest in this. And if you talked to me 5 years ago, that was the worst academic advice I ever received. But now it's one of the best, right? So I don't know. I just feel some cases probably true, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. I do think that, even if I talk to the German idealist specialists, like they haven't explored like the world reception of German idealism. They're only talking within the framework of the European philosophy and how Kant is received in that context. There's just a whole another set of intellectual traditions that influence, right? So nobody's working on Brazilian reception of Kantian philosophy. There's a lot actually written in Portuguese, but nobody's paying attention, So I do think still a lot more to explore. And it's probably too premature to say, oh, we're just generating the new questions. I think there are some questions that we can be asking, but you're right. I think that some of the questions for the PhD are like, I do feel like, okay, what does that even matter? I do come across with these questions.
Yeah, I think some portion of what gets published in academic philosophy journals is pedantic, right? And also sort of published because people need to publish.
Right. Also,
right?
Necessity.
And I do think over the course of a career, right? And I say this as someone who, is sort of, I don't know, had a permanent academic post for about a quarter of a century now. I do think if you're going to be a successful researcher, you do have to care about what you're writing about, right? You'll just sort of run out of momentum and devotion if you're just sort of saying, well, I've got to publish something, right? And once you have a level of security in academic life where, it's a good thing that you publish, but it's not sort of, you're past the parish point, then I think you do want to ask yourself, am I publishing just for the sake of publishing, or am I publishing because I think this is an area where, we human beings need to understand these things more deeply. And even though, you're talking about a discipline, right, that has a, 2,000-3,000 year history, both in Europe and Asia and all the, Africa, all these other traditions, so forth, it's still remarkable to me how much of the world is, if you will, sort of philosophically under-investigated, right? I mean, to use my own case, I've been writing a lot on philosophical issues related to grief over the past about decade now. But when I first started writing on it, there were like a handful of papers that philosophers have ever written about it, right? And now it's this like thriving area of research, not just for me, but there's other people publishing on it, and it's a thing now. And so I'm always surprised in a good way, right, about how much unexplored reality there is for philosophers. I mean, one of the huge growth areas in recent philosophy is artificial intelligence and all the issues that are raised by it, right? And I would say that 15 years ago there weren't too many people predicting, this is going to be an area where there's all this philosophical energy is going to be devoted, right? I mean, maybe a few people were predicting that, but I didn't hear it.
Right.
And who knows, what sorts of areas of philosophical experience, what areas of human experience are sort of still to be, a mind, right, for philosophical insight. I think we've seen huge growth in interest in philosophical issues arising out of things like disability, out of the trans experience, huge amounts of philosophical work on the emotions and looking at different specific emotions, in depth and our emotional life. So all of those are examples that I won't say they like came out of the blue exactly, right, but they weren't things that a generation ago people were thinking or writing about. So I think that if you're worried that sort of the world will run out of philosophical problems, I think I don't have that worry.
No.
Right?
Yeah. I think like there's going to be different focus, right? So that your generation is going to talk about environmental issues, ecological thinking. It was the thing, but it wasn't the epicenter of the topic. But I do think it will become one of the most important topic because the environmental impact of human industrial revolution will become visibly apparent to us, right? So I do think these topics are going to come, right? And then are we going to still talk about the historical figures like Kant and Hegel? I think we will. I don't think it's get to the point, like it might not be the case that the one department hires 5 specialists of Hegel and working on German idealism. But
unless you're Chicago.
Yeah. Or like Luxembourg, right? They have German idealism, master's degree. But I do think there's like questions that come up that requires looking back in history and pay attention to different ways in which we think about things.
Well, and again, I think it's a sign of how much more publicly engaged and dexterous philosophy has become, that as the world changes, philosophy goes along with it,
Yeah.
right? I mean, all the philosophical work, like in social epistemology, having to do with social media and the internet, and these kinds of things, like,
Mm-hmm.
obviously such work wouldn't have been done in the 1990s. Those technologies hadn't emerged yet. But,
Mm-hmm.
when they do, right, I think philosophers are increasingly skillful at applying their own capacities, right, to think about these emerging phenomena. And that's all to the good.
Maybe the one, the measurement by which you can say, oh, this is a good question or not, is like, is this the question that I'll be asking next 10 years? Right? The question of the grief, for instance, is something that you would ask as long as the human life exists and passes away, right? It's a part of the human reality that we have to ask question. So I do think it's something that we have to pay attention to, that we are just providing these conceptual clarifications and publishing for the sake of publishing. That's true, but we can just, reel back in and just ask, is this asking a good question about human life? And I think that's easy to put on ourselves as kind of measurement. Is this something that is actually helping me think better about something? Is it going to help other people having the same kind of issues? And it will become apparent that this is not just publishing for the sake of publishing. Yeah.
I noticed, coming back to the discussion about kind of in academia and then an eye outside of academia, I wanted to ask you guys about, I'm talking about finding that part of philosophy that hasn't been a lot of research into. I've noticed when you were talking about grief and AI and ecological stuff, these are all issues and things that you don't necessarily come to by heading the books, reading a bunch, and then you go in a sentence like, this person didn't say this. It's things you're thinking about life in a more broad sense, and then you kind of take that and bring it into academia. So it seems like it's very related to kind of finding those things that are not being talked about in academia comes from experiences that are not purely academic experiences.
Where does this extra academic motivation come from? That's a really good question, right? And for me, it's more of the interaction with the students. So when we started to talk about things in the classroom, some students started to ask me questions that relation to their experience, right? So the trans experience, for instance, is like it wasn't a traditional discourse in academia for a long time, but then we started to have students that are more open to discussing these issues, then it will hit, right? So like for me, extra academic motivation or like input is usually conversation with the students, right? And it kind of becomes a part of research. So when we talk about liberation of Japanese women for the sake of Japanese women in the context of Japanese philosophy, that's the same logic would apply to transgender identity. And we talk about that in the classroom, and I just started to think about, that's a really good research topic, right? Something like that. Literature maybe also, like the bestsellers that are general, Pulitzer Prize books sometimes do inspire these kind of conversations for me.
Yeah, I don't, have a great answer to all these things, sort of where the kind of non-academic motivations come from. Nietzsche had the thought that sort of philosophy is a way of engaging in autobiography. I don't think that's false. On the other hand, I don't think it's entirely true either. I don't think that's the only thing that we're doing. In some ways, I also think that if you're in philosophy for long enough, the direction of flow is in both directions, right? That sort of doing philosophy also shapes biographies, right? But I would say that if you're in the field for long enough, you may not know, right, quite what lies behind all of the things that you're interested in philosophically. So, I mean, in my own case, I write on quite a diversity of different topics. But as I've thought about it, I've begun to see that there's a link among a lot of them, right? Which is roughly that I'm sort of interested in adversity in human experience, sort of, experiences that we think of as sort of challenging obstacles, to living good lives, and in particular, how that intersects broadly with sort of freedom in a social sense, giving people the chance to figure out how to deal, right, with these kinds of problems and what freedom we should give them and so forth. So there isn't a area of specialization in philosophy called philosophy of adversity, but I suppose if there were, I'd be, up near the top of people thinking about that. But that's not something that I recognized in my own work necessarily as I was undertaking it. It only sort of, dawned on me, right? Sort of what links all these different sorts of things that I'm interested in. So I think in some ways, we don't have a very good handle maybe on what kind of drives our interests in particular kinds of philosophical questions. And it's not sort of always easy to read off, I think, from what people are interested in philosophically, kind of what is intriguing or enticing about those problems. I think we kind of it's a more dynamic sort of process, right? We engage with a problem and we're shaped by the engagement, and how we think about the problem is shaped by larger factors in life and so forth. So I think it's often very subtle, right?
Yeah. So for instance, Japanese philosophy, I was just working on it, purely scholarly interest, but I think the way the university is framing it is in the context of cultural multiculturalism and equality, diversity, inclusion, and decolonizing curriculum. All these like extra curriculum motivations that influence actually frame my project, right? That they want to read Japanese philosophy from that perspective, which is not the same from a Japanese person reading Japanese philosophy. That's a completely different motivation. So it's not always clear why we are developing this way, because my motivation for researching Japanese philosophy wasn't always about decolonizing multiculturalism in Europe. It was just a pure scholarly interest. So there is not a single answer to that, but I do think, when the politics swing to the right, academia swing to the left, right, it's obvious like link between public discourse to like academic response to the public discourse.
Right. I mean, I was, well, we'll wrap it up soon, but I was very interested in the notion of kind of what you mentioned about philosophy being an autobiography. And I'm curious in both of your cases, from a personal perspective, if there is anything in your personal like biographies that you think has influenced your philosophical interest today.
What part of your life? What part of your life?
Well, I mean, I guess.
What made you sad?
Well, that's just the thing, is that people who are familiar with my areas of research might think I'm a rather dour person, but in reality, I'm not. And there's actually lots of good evidence, by the way, that thinking about mortality is good for us, at least a little bit. It's probably beneficial to our well-being. I don't know. I guess I would say that I was exposed relatively early in life to a fair amount of people struggling with their own existence, sadness, adversity, that sort of thing. So as I said, I don't think I recognize that as a kind of unifying thread, across a lot of what I've written as a philosopher until much later. But I would say that that's true. I would also sort of say that, again, in terms of thinking about biography and, what one is interested in philosophy, but I think going back to something we were discussing early on, you cannot, right, get into academic philosophy, and probably in any academic field now, thinking that you're going to stay close to home, right, geographically. I mean, you might, but, there's a good chance you won't. And so I suspect one of the things that you do end up reflecting upon nowadays, sort of in the middle of your career as philosopher, is that you're pretty far away, right, in a lot of ways from the places and people that you were brought up in. I have friends in academic contexts on 5 continents. My sort of circle of people that I would recognize as sort of my colleagues and friends is dispersed everywhere. I think that's a good thing, but I think that there's definitely a personality type or a mindset that struggles with that thought, right? I mean, there's this old point of view. Takeshi probably knows better than I do. Was it Wittgenstein or somebody who said, sort of philosophers are people who are not at home in the world, right? I think that's true in a double sense now, right? We're people who like to ask questions that other people tend not to ask, but then because of our professional situations, most of us are not where we started in the world. right? For better or for worse. In my own case, for better, but I can understand it would be for worse for some.
And I think also like being intellectual exile, or the actual physical exile, is that it allows you to ask the question of whether or not the establishment is presenting certain narrative, whether or not we can trust it. And most of the time, the philosopher is the one said, I don't think that's a good question to ask. That's the right way to answer that question. I think we're in a position to actually like give them like curveball, right? That just to look from the different angle, and I don't think that's a way to actually think about things. And I think, maybe that's also the part of, maybe because the reason why I'm studying Japanese philosophy, I miss home and food so much that, I can use the research leave as excuse to go home. That's also possible. But I do think it's like, it's kind of like what we presented as what we specialize is really part of who we are in some ways. That, like I just started to realize like I can't think about philosophy without incorporating some of the Japanese philosophy or East Asian philosophy, because it's part of my language and heritage. So how do we actually negotiate between two ways of thinking about things? And in fact, the Japanese philosophers struggle to think traditionally because we thoroughly modernize, right? So these questions become kind of hits me home. But if I stay in Japan, I don't think I could have done this research, because it would have never even occurred to me that the idea of doing Japanese philosophy in English, for instance. Yeah. So maybe the questions that you're going to ask for your thesis and PhD is not something that you force, but it comes to you as you describe your own experience as intellectual. Maybe that's something that I would, recommend to think about instead of forcing it, because it's forcing some questions that often like you come up with the questions that you can answer, get good grade. Those are not really.
Yeah, that's always a balance, even in undergraduate.
And it happens with the publication,
like,
because like somebody's writing on this topic, they ask you to contribute. It's like, I don't have not much to say, but I have to write something, for the chapter. It does happen with us, and it's easier to kind of resort to that as a student, I think.
Well, then coming back to your first question, what do you think? Is it worth it?
Well, I'm supposed to answer now. I don't know.
Yeah. What do you think?
I mean, maybe we'll see. As we were saying at the beginning, the way I see it is like the end goal is very desirable, but the process of getting there, as we're saying, is another thing. Which
I think, like even, maybe this is to Asian philosophy, but whether you decided to go to academia or decided not to go to academia, whether or not you become philosophical is a separate question, right? So as Michael was saying, that you could actually stay tuned with the philosophical programs and philosophical thinking
of course,
while you're working in a different area. And that would really help you succeed in the career as a philosopher, right? So it's like you could actually go to graduate program and do the same thing as well. But it doesn't limit you from your future. I think whatever you choose, you could become a philosopher, or you decided to just not to do that, right?
Right. I mean, another aspect of my research, another area of my research is ethical issues related to work and labor. And much of what I say there is kind of skeptical about work, right? And people automatically assume that this means that I'm dissatisfied with my own work. and in fact, the opposite is the case. I mean, in some ways, what's motivated me to think about those issues is a recognition that if you are ambitious and hardworking and catch a few breaks and get lucky, academic life can be an extremely good profession to be in. Extremely good profession to be in. And in some ways, my interest in these ethical questions around work and labor arises from a recognition that maybe I have it pretty good and a lot of people don't, right? And then we should say something about the reality of the people who don't. But I think the reason why, even when I tell students that the job prospects for academic PhDs in philosophy is not very good, and, you won't have probably a choice of where to live. And I mean, there is something that I see in students, which is a kind of dim recognition that there are aspects of the work that are incredibly, incredibly good, right? The level of autonomy that you have as an academic is almost unprecedented compared to almost any other institution you might work in, right? Nobody works for me, right? In the sense that I don't really supervise anyone, and I don't really report to anyone, right? In any meaningful sense. I mean, I'm accountable to the institution, but there's not somebody sort of looking over my shoulder about what I'm doing all the time, right? I get to, keep thinking about things that are intriguing and interesting to me. I get to figure out how to communicate those things effectively to students and get them interested in it. I get to meet, a wide range of people from different parts of the world who are, very intelligent and, have interesting insights to share with me. I get to travel. I've been to lots of parts of the world that I almost certainly would not have been to were it not for academic life. So, I think students, again, as I was saying earlier, maybe don't have a very full picture, right, of what our job involves. But I think in some cases, they have a dim intimation of the good stuff, right? And there's a lot of good stuff, right? If you're successful at it, right, there's a lot of good stuff. And I would also just say that, and this is maybe to wax slightly poetical about it, but I think that one of the things I found most valuable about it is the fact that when you are institutions of higher education, there's people coming in and out, students, right, every year, right? So, every year I sort of feel this sense, right, of, well, here we are, it's September, right? There's going to be a new batch of people, right, to interact with. It feels new to me every time, even though I've been doing it for a quarter of a century, right? It's energizing even now, right, that I get this opportunity to interact with new people, learn new things, and that sort of thing. So it's, great work if you can get it, but the if is a really big if.
Yeah. Yeah.